brief Purim joke. One might say that those parties that Esther hosted for Haman and Achashverosh, there's no question that Haman was affected by those parties in a much, much, much more intense way. I mean, after all, he had a very serious hangover. Sorry. All right. So we've started talking about the idea of lotteries, of that there's this, that Purim is referred to by the term lotteries because the idea of a lottery is not just the fact that there was a lottery as part of this story, but there's something much bigger there. There's something much larger. And so that's where the Rebbe gets into this whole thing right here. He says this can all be understood based on the following statement in Torah. And I just want to point out that this statement actually comes from the Zohar.
It sounded good.
The Alter Rebbe expands the ideas much more, and I'll tell you the difference in just a moment. Hang on a second.
Yeah. Okay.
So the statement is that the holidays of Purim and Yom Kippurim, Yom Kippur, are related to each other. Now, how, of course, you might obviously ask yourself, how are Purim and Yom Kippur relative to each other? There's seems to be nothing similar whatsoever between the two holidays. How could you possibly compare the two holidays? Now, the Zohar says this. And when the Zohar says it, it says that the reason why the two of them are similar is because in the future, we will rejoice on Yom Kippurim like we do nowadays on Purim. And that's the reason why the day of Yom Kippur is referred to as Yom HaKippurim. Kippurim means it's similar to Purim. That right now it's not Purim, but it will be. And that's what it says in the Zohar. And the reason why we're quoting this from Torah Or is that the Alter Rebbe takes this whole concept a giant step further. And he says it's not just that in the future, someday we're going to celebrate on Yom Kippur the same way we do on Purim, but there's a relevance to each other nowadays as well. And I just want to point out, this is a complete side point, but it is important to remember. Now, there's a classic joke of the guy who's celebrating his 50th anniversary, and he gets up and he says, I just want to say these 50 years have been to me just like 2 days. And everybody's, oh, isn't that sweet? And somebody comes over to him and says, really, can you please elaborate about this? You said something so beautiful, your relationship has been like 2 days. And he says, yeah, I didn't say which 2 days. The guy says, what do you mean? He says, they've been like Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. Now, what I don't like about that joke is two things. First of all, of course, I feel bad for the guy's wife. I feel bad for the guy. The relationship should never get to that point. But what I don't like is you can't compare the two. And Tisha B'Av is a legitimately sad day. Yom Kippur is a day that actually involves a certain amount of internal joy. And the reason for that is because of the fact that we're being granted forgiveness. It's not called Yom HaSlicha. It's called Yom HaKippurim. It's the day of atonement. And we are relating back to God in such a way where we are atoning for everything. We're able to eradicate the negativity within ourselves. And so therefore it's a completely different experience. And so therefore it is a holiday. And in fact, the Talmud says that in temple times, when the Kohen Gadol used to leave, and we said this actually in the prayers in Musaf, when the Kohen Gadol would leave the Beit HaMikdash for the final time after finishing all the service, if Yom Tov Hayah, they would make a massive. It was a massive holiday. They couldn't eat yet because the holiday wasn't over, but there was a tremendous amount of joy, and the women would go and dance in the streets, and it was a tremendous celebration. So people forget about that because they focus just on the fasting, but that's when you are focusing on the wrong things. We feel bad about the past, but Yom Kippur is not just about feeling bad about the past. It's about renewing the relationship. And so therefore, it's a very powerful day. It happens to be, strangely enough, I guess, one might say, if you can say this, my favorite holiday. I don't know if I can say my favorite holiday, but basically something like that. It's hard to pick a favorite holiday, but I enjoy Yom Kippur very, very much. So, but at the same time, Purim is Purim. It's completely, Purim is it's looked at oftentimes as just a child's play. It's looked at as, parties and fairs and getting drunk and all that kind of stuff. And it doesn't seem to have any seriousness or religiosity in it. And the reason why is because the depth of Purim is by its nature hidden. And so we're going to talk about a little bit about what that depth is and what the holiday is over this mimer. But it's just fascinating, again, to compare these two almost incomparable holidays, Yom Kippur and Purim. So the Rebbe continues and says, in fact, the name Yom Kippurim itself means that Yom Kippur is similar to Purim. And then the Rebbe points out, and moreover, the comparison is made in such a way that it denotes that Purim is greater than Yom Kippur because the latter is being compared to the former. Yom Kippur is only similar to Purim. Where you see this truly being reflected is the fact that the Talmud says that in the future, all holidays will become nullified, except for Purim. And some people say except for Hanukkah as well. So from this mimer, we'll be able to understand that even though we don't specifically mention it here, but several ideas that we'll mention here will show the reason why Purim has this greatness over other holidays. And hopefully you'll be able to expand the idea besides for what he says here, based on several other memorim, which are very, very, very important. So what are the similarities between Purim and Yom Kippur? One of the similarities between the two is that both holidays contain a lottery. Purim, of course, as stated earlier, is named after Haman's dice throwing. And one of the major ceremonies in the Beit HaMikdash on Yom Kippur was the lottery held over two goats. One to be sacrificed and the other to be cast as the scapegoat. And so just describe that, this is all mentioned in of course, in the Torah itself in Parshat Acharimot. And it's described in great detail in Masechet Yoma, which deals with the sacrifices of and the whole process in the Beit HaMikdash on Yom Kippur. But basically what they took is two goats that were similar in size, weight, value, look, as much as possible. Tried to get goats that were as similar as possible, had to be the same age. And they had two dice basically in a box. They would mix them around, and without looking, the Kohen Gadol would take the two of them out, put one on one goat's head, the other on the other goat's head. One dice said La Hashem, and that one would be sacrificed, and the other one says La Azazel. Of course, I'm sure you the Israelis all know the term Lech La Azazel. I'm not trying to swear over here, but basically the term comes from the goat that was thrown off to Azazel is basically this cliff that was outside of Jerusalem, and the word Az means basically a strong rocky place, and they would throw it off the cliff. And that's actually where the term scapegoat comes from. And the idea was that all of the negativity that the Jewish people have taken up should be should be cast away like this goat, while the positively should be sacrificed to God and should be uplifted to God. So there's this lottery, a lottery on Yom Kippur. This was obviously something that was a big deal. It was a central part of the Yom Kippur services. And so therefore the similarity is because of the fact that both of them have lots. That's number one. And then the Rebbe says there's also another connection between the two holidays. The Torah uses the expression regarding Yom Kippur, Lifnei Hashem, Lifnei Havai, Lifnei Yud Kei Vav Kei, that you will receive your atonement before God. Before, in other words, higher than Havaya, that Yom Kippur is such that it brings an atonement that is higher than the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. Yom Kippur is a day that is beyond these systems. And so even when a person has caused defects in the name of God through the things that we've done inappropriately, on Yom Kippur you can attain atonement because it supersedes everything. It's higher than the name of God. Now, what's the comparison with Purim? And likewise, one reason given for why Megillat Esther does not contain God's name is that Purim contains a revelation of the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, which is likewise beyond Havaya. The Megillah is not just a story. The Megillah is a complex text with tremendous secrets hidden within it. The question is, okay, in that case, why is God's name not mentioned in it? So some people say that the reason why is because it was written during Persian rule, and the Mordechai and Esther, when they wrote the book, they were afraid that the Persians would insert their gods into it. And so therefore they said, better let's not put any names of God, let's just allude to God. And so therefore anytime it uses the word Hamelech, that refers to God, or in certain circumstances, even as we're going to see, the name Achashverosh, as we're going to see, actually is reference to God. But God's name is not mentioned. But that's a very, very simplistic reason. It could have been updated a couple of years later. Persian rule didn't last that much longer. So the next level of interpretation of this concept is that the whole story of Purim is encapsulated in the words Megillat Esther. Megillat, of course, means a scroll. Esther is the woman's name. But the word Megillat actually comes from the word revelation, Gilui. And Esther comes from the word hidden. And so the whole concept of Purim is to reveal that which is hidden. That's, of course, why we dress up. There's something, the way things look, and then there's what's going on behind the facade. That you might think that the whole story of Esther is a political story, but it's not. It's a spiritual story. And you need to be able to dig behind the facade, to be able to scrape away at the various levels that are on the top in order to be able to see the struggle. And then there's a further level that we're going to discuss over here, and we're going to connect some of these ideas over this mimer. The further level that we say here is because the Megillah contains such power that is actually beyond Yud Kei Vav Kei. And that's the reason why when Mashiach comes, Purim will still be a full-on holiday. But we still don't know why. We don't understand what is so special about Purim that we can say these things. So the Rebbe continues and says we can understand the relationship between these two holidays when we understand what a lottery is all about. What's a lottery? Everything physical is a manifestation of something spiritual. And so therefore, if there is something in physicality, it's referencing something that is in the higher realms. And lottery is unique because you could have somebody who's dirt poor and suddenly the very next day or 5 minutes later, they are rich beyond belief. They become one of the richest people in the world in a moment. There's no other situation in the world that works that way. And so therefore you can understand, because of that complete turnaround, you can understand that it comes from a very high and deep place. The Rebbe continues and says, a lot is a mechanism that is beyond rationale. It doesn't make sense. He explains, lottery is made up of items of absolute equality. For example, the two goats on Yom Kippur were meant to be equal in look, height, and value. When one object is better than another in any particular fashion, there's no need for a lottery, because you compare the two of them and say, okay, this one's better, I want that. You only need to throw dice when you have no good reason to be able to choose one over the other. And he says when two objects are utterly equal, there's no logical reason to choose one over the other. A lottery, being a supra-rational system, is therefore used to pick one over the other. Of course, the lotteries that we have in the Florida lottery or whatever the other lotteries use numbers. Why should one number be any better than another one? When you're picking one person's choice of numbers over somebody else's choice of numbers, there's no logical reason why this person should win over that person. None. It's at random. And that, by the term at random, it means that there's no logical system to it. And so the Rebbe explains that both Yom Kippur and Purim reference a lottery, as they are both holidays which draw down a revelation from beyond the systematic and logical emanations of Ishtalshalut, beyond Havaya. And again, this is a theme that we've seen throughout the Maimarim that we've been teaching, and this throughout Chassidus. The idea of Ishtalshalut is that it is a systematic, one level leads to the next. And there's always in any system, there's a tit for the tat. There's a cause and effect. And the cause has to be relative to the effect. But in the lottery, there's no relevance between the cause and effect. The person has done absolutely nothing more than the person next to them. You could have somebody who goes out and buys 100,000 tickets in a lottery that has 101 or 100,001 tickets. And so the odds would bend heavily towards this person, but the other person wins the lottery. Like I say, it's not fair. I bought 100,000 tickets, but a lottery is a lottery. And so therefore the one that was chosen was the one that was not you. Just the system doesn't lend itself to rationality. It doesn't lend itself to logic per se. I know that in I think it's in quantum dynamics and in game theory, randomness is used as part of the system. And I am not smart enough to know what that means or to know how to compare it to what we're saying here. And so for that, we're just going to stick to the literal concepts and leave the scientific ideas of randomness and all that kind of thing to people who actually know what they're talking about. So we see this concept that Yom Kippur and Purim are related because they both have an element of beyond rationale. So let's look at Yom Kippur because that's the easier one. Yom Kippur is a day, the day itself atones. What does that mean? That means a person comes to shul and they do whatever they're supposed to do. And so therefore Hashem says, I will forgive you. Why? You would think that a person has done so many things over the course of the entire year, and they have allowed the relationship with God to go so far astray, they've done whatever they've done, that at this point, there's no way to be able to get forgiveness. One day, a year comes around and everything disappears. It's not logical. But yeah, we reach beyond logic on Yom Kippur. Purim. And of course, we're going to get into the greater elements of what's going on and why Haman did what he did soon. But Purim is supposed to be Purim is all about Adar wins, everything turned over. And so therefore in Purim, people, have fun, go completely nuts, go crazy. Adar you drink until you don't know the difference between Marach Mordechai, blessed is Mordechai, and cursed is Haman. I struggle with that very much. I don't like drinking, so I need to put that out. I'm not a drinker, and in terms of this element, I struggle with this. Everybody's got mitzvot that they enjoy doing, and some mitzvot that are much more difficult for them to do. So, Purim is celebrated in a way that's beyond logic. You get yourself drunk. What's the point of that? Judaism, in general, is very much about using your head. It's about deliberate action, focused action, making the right decisions. Not just logic. It's very much beyond that. But what's this whole idea of Adar? So we can see there's a relationship there in the theme because both of them are beyond logic. So chapter 3 takes it a little bit further. And he says, but a lottery is not only beyond intellect. It's not just beyond logic, logical sequence. 1 + 1 = 2. This person deserves that. Pure equations. It is even higher than will that supersedes logic. So within the human dynamic, of course, we have emotion, and the seat of the emotion, of course, is in the heart. Then you have intellect, which, of course, the seat of the intellect is in the mind. And then you have will. Will is what we described as an encompassing power. It's an energy that's beyond, because it's a drive that can morph itself into any particular aspect of yourself. It's not limited to the mind. It's not limited to the heart. It's not limited to any one aspect of the limbs of your body. Will is something that can drive a person to incredible capabilities if they just are able to focus that the drive of, this is what I want. And again, we're talking about something not like, okay, open up the fridge and say, oh, I want pizza for lunch. We're talking about a much deeper drive that is beyond the systems. So a lottery is higher than will that supersedes intellect. And we see this in the fact that when a person draws a lot, they decide to direct their will in accordance with the results of the lot. And the same is true above. The spiritual lottery reaches back into the master of will above even the divine will itself. So God created a system. God says, I want you to fulfill the Torah. I want you to do the mitzvot. And if you do those things properly, then you're going to get certain rewards. If you do things inappropriately, then you're going to have certain consequences. Comes Yom Kippur, and we say, actually, the entire system falls apart. And God says, I forgive you, everything's wiped clean. Why? Because Yom Kippur represents the lottery, so to speak, in God, in which there's a system which decides beyond logic, beyond will, even though God wanted these things, God wanted us to do Torah, God wanted us to do mitzvot. If we didn't, well, this idea of the lottery, the Yom Kippurim being beyond logic and beyond will, God decides, okay, we're going to shake the lot out, so to speak, and the Jewish people, all right, I forgive you, and now I'm going to direct my will in accordance with that, with what falls out in the lottery. And the Rebbe continues, it says, fittingly, the writing of the name Avaya, Yud Vavke, begins with the point rising over the letter Yud, which alludes to the divine will. This is, of course, a Kabbalistic idea. Each one of the letters, as they are written, represents certain things. So Yud represents Chachma, the first stage of Ishtalshalut, and the little, you want to call it a thorn, so to speak, little tip on the top of the Yud is representative of the beginning of that system, which is Ratzon, God's will. So when we state that both Yom Kippur and Purim are above Havaya and both contain elements of a lottery, this signifies both holidays' elevated status, both represent and elicit a revelation of the master of will. Now we understand it with regards to Yom Kippur, but we do not yet understand it with regards to Purim. Yom Kippur, like we said, is the whole idea is God forgiving us. And so the fact that God forgives us means that, hey, I am going to let go of the things that I wanted, and I'm going to let go of the fact that I wanted you to accomplish certain things, and this is the system that I created. These are the consequences I set up. I'm going to let those things go. I'm going to absolve my will because of the fact that I am, God says, the master of will. I can choose where to put my will. So we can understand that how that represents Yom Kippur. But we still have no idea how this idea reflects on Purim, because Purim, again, doesn't seem to be a very special holiday. It doesn't seem to have any spiritual significance whatsoever. It doesn't seem to be something that represents something greater. What's going on? You look at the basics, bare bones of the story, what you see is, like we said before, a master of politics. Mordechai, he's an advisor to the king. He knows what's going on. Esther is the king's favorite wife. But you see that they don't really lend themselves to that. You see that Esther says, listen, I can't go to the king because he hasn't seen me in a long time. The only way I'm going to the king is if you fast for 3 days. Absolve even the holiday of Pesach. They fasted over the first day of the holiday of Pesach, and because the situation was so dire. And that's the reason why the pasuk in the Megillah says, "Vayavor Mordechai," and Mordechai passed over. Mordechai went over something, and the rabbis in the Talmud, Masechet Megillah, asked, "What did he pass over?" And the answer was that he passed over Pesach in accordance with Esther's will, and that's the reason why he was very shocked at her request. But they realized that this was about something much deeper, and that a greater something needed to accomplishment. And Esther told Mordechai, fast on this Pesach so that you will be alive for the next Pesach. So you see that Mordechai and Esther realize that there's something going on here, but it doesn't seem to be clear anywhere else. And that's really where we're going to take the in the next chapter, we're going to explain how the differences between how they're applied. But in chapter 5, we're finally going to understand how this applies into Purim. And that's going to be very, very much trying to understand where Haman was coming from. What was his perspective? How's everybody doing with that? Any questions before we go on?
Edith had a question, Mrs. Resnick.
Yes. I just wanted to say, I see where the connection is with fasting, where we fast on Yom Kippur, they were asked to fast on Purim, but what does the fasting actually accomplish? That's what I want to know. We always hear about fasting. What does it really do?
Excellent question. The idea of fasting is basically that it brings a person a little bit away from their physical drives. They're no longer focused on basically the animalistic tendency of feeding. And that's what it's supposed to do. Of course, for most of us, it just makes us hungry, and therefore we're thinking about eating more than not. And that's the reason why fasting, more than the fast that we've been prescribed, is a negative thing. Back in the day, they used to do lots and lots of fasts, but that was when people had a completely different system, digestive system within themselves. They were eating much less and much healthier. They obviously weren't living as long, but that's a different story. But generally speaking, the way it's looked up in Jewish thought is that Tanya specifically mentions it, that basically people were stronger, more capable of just fasting for longer periods back in the day. Nowadays, we specifically only do the 5 fasts because we need to be able to have some time that brings us away from just connection with physicality. That's the basic idea. And then there's another idea of basically you put yourself a little bit in a kind of a painful strait, so to speak, in a situation where you're not feeling as good, and so therefore you're more motivated to ask God for the things, for forgiveness, and ask God for the things that you need in a more humble way, because you're not doing it in a way that's kind of kicking back and saying, all right, God, there's a synagogue that I go to once a year that I don't particularly enjoy because the seats in the synagogue are theater seats. And so basically you kick back and you kind of sink into the seats, and it's like, all right, God, welcome to my office. That's not really the way we're supposed to pray. We're supposed to pray with contrite feeling and connection, the desire for connection. And so the fasting is supposed to help us elicit those things by reminding ourselves that it's not just about the here and now. It's not just about my full stomach. It's about something greater than me. Any other questions?
Well, I considered fasting is almost like cleansing, because nothing's coming in, but also, again, fasting is denying yourself some pleasure relative to, the atonement process.
Yeah, very, very, that's absolutely correct. Go ahead.
So use your time for better things than just worrying about eating.
I don't worry about it. I fantasize about eating.
It occupies your mind. So forget about
right,
it.
But it's pleasurable.
Robert, Rabbi, I would agree with what Robert says. I've been fasting. I'm in my 80s, and I've been fasting since, and also the religious holidays, since I was 27, on and off. And my general health, thank God, is the doctors don't understand how I can be so healthy at my age or whatever, God willing. So what it does is it does cleanse you. Is what happens is that your body then takes the energy that would happen to digesting food and to getting rid of the toxics in your body. And so therefore, but it's a water fast, not like we do on the holidays, where it isn't a water fast. So what the water does is flushes that out of your system. It's becoming more of an accepted view today, on that it's a valid thing. So, I'm a living example, so that does tell me of this philosophy, which is, I have a mentor does that anyway, of cleansing your body through fasting. And I think it actually helps your mind to, first of all, it's a fantastic thing, a control of will. It develops your will. That is one side of it, on your character. And the other side is that, that it actually makes you think clearer. So
Sounds
the
like
physiological
a good plan.
reason for it. It's not the spiritual reason, but again, it's spiritual thing. Well,
It's a healthy
Everybody.
habit.
It's exactly it. Well, Yasher Koach to everybody. We will see you, God willing, on Wednesday, on Friday, and continue then.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.